The Bloodline of Night. Part 1. The Echoes of Old York. The city of New York had always been a blend of the old and the new, its skyline towering above streets that had witnessed centuries of history. But deep within the veins of this great city, nestled in the forgotten corners, a different kind of history thrived, a history not meant for the eyes of the living. Duncan Blackwood was a man who had seen it all. An investigator, a seeker of answers in the face of darkness. But there were some things he had never prepared himself for. Vampires. They were nothing more than a childhood nightmare, something parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the night. But Duncan had learned the hard way that those childhood stories were grounded in more than just myth. It was a humid evening in the heart of Manhattan when Duncan received the call. His phone buzzed with an unknown number, and instinctively he answered. "Duncan Blackwood," he said, his voice gravelly from years of chasing shadows. "Mr. Blackwood, I need your help." The voice on the other end was strained, desperate. "There's something wrong with my family. Please come to the West End district. They're not who they seem." The call disconnected before Duncan could ask any further questions. A chill ran down his spine, but the lure of the unknown was too strong. He had no choice but to follow the call. The West End district was an area Duncan knew well, known for its mix of old-world charm and modern decay. The streets were narrow, lined with towering brownstones that had seen better days. But what struck Duncan most was the unsettling silence that hung in the air. The hum of the city, usually so vibrant, seemed muted here. The address he was given led him to an old, Gothic-style mansion that loomed over the street. Its windows were shuttered, and the wrought iron gate creaked in the wind as though the house itself were alive. The man who had called him stood by the entrance, his face pale and drawn. "You must be Duncan," the man said, his voice shaky. "I'm Thomas. Thank you for coming." Duncan studied him. Thomas appeared to be in his late 30s, but there was something about him that felt timeless. His eyes had a hollow, sunken look, like someone who hadn't seen daylight in years. And yet, despite his obvious distress, there was a strange calmness in his demeanor. "I didn't think vampires existed," Duncan muttered, half to himself. Thomas flinched but didn't answer. He led Duncan inside, where the air grew colder with each step. The mansion was dimly lit, with shadows dancing along the walls as if they had a life of their own. Duncan's instincts screamed at him to turn around, to walk away from whatever this was, but his curiosity overpowered his caution. As they descended deeper into the house, the sounds of murmurs and laughter echoed through the halls. It was like walking into a forgotten world, one where the laws of time and nature didn't apply. The deeper they went, the more Duncan began to feel as though he were being watched. Finally, they reached a large, ornate door at the end of the hallway. Thomas paused before opening it, taking a deep breath. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Inside, the room was lavishly furnished, but it felt cold, oppressive. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals reflecting the faint light from the fireplace. And sitting at the far end of the room was a family that, at first glance, seemed perfectly ordinary. The woman at the head of the table looked to be in her early 40s, with dark, sleek hair and a regal bearing. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. Beside her sat a man, older but no less commanding. His skin was unnaturally pale, and his lips were pulled into a tight, almost predatory smile. The children, 2 of them, sat quietly, their faces serene, as if they were unaware of the world around them. But Duncan noticed the faintest glint in their eyes, too old, too known. "This is my family," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "But they're not human. They've been changed. Something happened to them, something unnatural." Duncan studied them carefully, his instincts sharpening. There was a darkness to them, a coldness that even the most skilled actors couldn't mask. These people, this family, were not of this world. They were something else entirely. "Tell me what happened," Duncan demanded, his voice firm. "And don't leave anything out." Thomas took a deep breath, his face paling further. "It started a few months ago. My father, the patriarch of the family, passed away under strange circumstances. Shortly after, my mother and sister, they changed. They stopped eating, stopped sleeping. But it wasn't just that. They began to crave something. They'd leave the house at night, come back with blood on their hands. I don't know how to explain it, but I know they aren't who they used to be." He glanced back at the family, who were now watching Duncan with intense, unblinking stares. "I've tried everything. I've tried to get help, but no one believes me. No one will listen." Duncan stepped closer, his gaze shifting from Thomas to the family. He could feel the power emanating from them, a malevolent force that pulsed through the room. He could see now that they weren't merely changed. They were something ancient, something older than the city itself. "Are they vampires?" Duncan asked, his voice low. Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I think so. And I think they're growing stronger. Every night they feed. And every night they get closer to something. I don't know what it is, but I fear it's too late to stop them." The family stood up in unison, their movements fluid and unnatural. The woman smiled, revealing sharp, elongated canines. "You've come to the wrong place, Mr. Blackwood." She purred, her voice sweet but laced with venom. "This family has been waiting for you. We have plans for you, just as we have plans for the city." Duncan's blood ran cold. He had walked into something much darker than he had anticipated, and he had no idea how deep this web of deception and terror truly went. But one thing was certain, this family wasn't just feeding on blood. They were feeding on something much more insidious, the very soul of New York City. Part 2, The Crimson Web. The air in the parlor thickened, heavy as syrup and impossible to breathe. Duncan didn't flinch, though he could feel the woman's eyes drilling into him. He didn't dare move too quickly. Vampires didn't just hunger, they hunted. And judging by the smile playing at the corners of her mouth, this wasn't the first time she trapped prey in this room. "You've done your research," Duncan said slowly, eyes darting to the fireplace poker nearby. "You knew I'd come." The woman took a step forward, graceful and inhuman. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor. "Oh, we didn't just know you'd come," she whispered. "We called you." Duncan's gaze snapped to Thomas. "Why do you think I asked for your help?" Thomas said, voice brittle. "I had to. She made me. They'd kill me if I didn't, if I tried to leave. But I swear I didn't know the full extent of it. I didn't know what they were becoming. You poor, loyal son." The matriarch cooed, placing a delicate hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You've been such a good vessel." Thomas twitched at her touch, but didn't move. Didn't dare move. "You said becoming," Duncan growled. "What are they now?" The woman's smile widened, and her lips drew back further to reveal not just fangs, but rows of jagged, translucent teeth that shimmered beneath the light like shards of glass. Her mouth looked like it could split her skull in half. "We are what your ancestors feared, Hunter. What your kind tried to bury beneath burning cathedrals and salted earth. We are Sangreal, true blood. The firstborn." Duncan's heart dropped into his stomach. That name, Sangreal. He'd only ever read about it in the oldest of texts. Whispers of a bloodline so ancient, even elder vampires feared them. Creatures born not from bites, but from rituals. Made, not turned. Not undead. Never alive. He didn't think they were real. But looking at the family now, the father's eyes black as spilled ink, the children's porcelain skin and silver tongues, he understood. They weren't pretending. They were sangreal. And they were multiplying. "I've heard of you," Duncan said, backing toward the fireplace slowly, and twitching toward the iron poker. "You fed on royalty, corrupted entire nations from the shadows. But you were wiped out." The woman cocked her head. "History is just a bedtime story written by the winners. And we are very much awake." She flicked her fingers, and the door behind Duncan slammed shut of its own accord. The flames in the hearth flared blue for a moment, then died entirely. They were sealing him in. "And what, you brought me here for dinner?" Duncan sneered, stalling. "You'll find I'm not exactly easy meat. We don't want your blood." The man, her husband, presumably, finally spoke. His voice was deeper, like something echoing out of a cavern. "We want your knowledge." A cold sweat slid down Duncan's back. This was worse than he thought. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted to learn from him. "I've hunted your kind," Duncan muttered. "You think I'll tell you anything? You already are," the matriarch said, tilting her head toward one of the children, her daughter, no older than 10 in appearance, but her eyes were older than ruin. She stood silently by the table, her lips moving, repeating Duncan's words back perfectly, mimicking his tone, his cadence. "Telepathy?" he asked. "No," the matriarch said. "Inheritance. We're evolving," the child whispered, in Duncan's own voice. That night, Duncan was locked in a room on the top floor. It wasn't a cell. It was far worse. It was a guest room. Lavish bed. Thick curtains. A mirror that reflected nothing. He wasn't a prisoner. He was expected to stay. They wanted him comfortable. That meant they weren't finished with him. He paced. Thought of every tool in his arsenal, every hidden blade and ward tattooed beneath his sleeves. But he'd walked in thinking this was just another vampire family nesting in some forgotten corner of the city. Not a blood cult wearing the skin of humans. Not a sangreal cell reviving themselves in plain sight. How long had they been here? What else had they done? Just as he knelt to inspect the windowsill for weaknesses, a voice came from behind him. "You should sleep." Duncan turned slowly. Thomas stood at the doorway, his silhouette tall and ghost-like in the dim candlelight. "You lured me into this," Duncan said coldly. "You knew." Thomas stepped inside, shut the door, and whispered, "Not all of it. I swear to God, Duncan, I just wanted to stop them. But Elira, she found out about you. She's in my head. Always in my head. And now..." He lifted his sleeve. Duncan's stomach twisted. The veins in Thomas's arm were turning black. Not the way blood vessels do when bruised. These moved, twitched, like worms swimming under his skin. "I've been marked," Thomas whispered. "I'm changing. I feel it. But I haven't turned yet. I still have time. But it's running out." Duncan nodded slowly. "So help me. We bring this whole house down. All of them with it." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "They sleep during the day. All of them. But only for a few hours. You have to make it count." Duncan reached for his bag tucked behind the nightstand. Hidden compartments snapped open. Vials. Sigils. Salt rounds. Liquid silver. And tucked in a velvet-lined case, his father's blade, etched with holy script. "When do they sleep?" Duncan asked. Thomas looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Just before dawn." And Duncan. "What?" Thomas hesitated, then said, They keep something beneath the house. Something ancient. Not even Alira controls it. They feed it. Duncan froze. Feed what? Thomas swallowed. Their firstborn. He didn't sleep that night. When the sky began to pale, Duncan crept from the room, every step silent, every breath measured. He followed Thomas through a hidden panel behind the library shelf, an old dumbwaiter shaft leading into the basement. The air grew colder. Foul. As they descended into the belly of the house, Duncan noticed carvings on the walls, symbols older than any vampire lore. Pre-Christian. Not Latin. Not Enochian. Something older. At the bottom, a vast chamber. And in the center, a pit. Carved into the stone were bones fused together by blood and sinew, forming a grotesque throne. Atop it sat a figure, massive and barely human. Its limbs were too long. Its skin translucent, showing rivers of black ichor pumping beneath. Its eyes opened. Not red. Not black. White. Blinding. Empty. And somehow still hungry. Thomas whispered beside him. That's the first child. Born of Alira and the old god they worship. She couldn't kill it, so she sealed it down here. The creature stirred. It didn't move like anything natural. It flowed, like liquid in a human shape. And then, it smiled. Alira's voice echoed through the chamber, no source, just sound vibrating in their skulls. You see now, Hunter. We are not monsters. We are evolution. The next chapter. And you are already part of our family. Duncan turned to Thomas, but Thomas was bleeding from his eyes. Run, he whispered. Please run. Duncan did. Part 3. The Feast Beneath the City. The creature in the pit stirred again, its eyes locking onto Duncan like a predator tasting the scent of its prey. Its mouth cracked open, revealing rows of jagged teeth, some too big for its skull, others curved in grotesque angles. It had no tongue. It didn't need one. Its hunger could only be quenched by the most primal of needs: blood, pain, and power. Duncan's heart raced. His instincts screamed at him to run, to flee as fast as he could. But there was nowhere to go. Behind him, the passage to the surface closed. The walls of the chamber shimmered with an unnatural glow, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. The silence that had settled over the house was now replaced by a low, buzzing hum, like the reverberation of 1,000 voices chanting from deep within the earth. Feed it. Alira's voice came again, filling every inch of the room, echoing off the stone walls. Give it what it wants, and it will grant you power. This city will be ours. All of it. Duncan's eyes flicked to Thomas, whose face had gone pale, his body trembling. He was still breathing, but barely. The veins in his neck were dark and swollen. The transformation was almost complete. Duncan didn't know how much longer his ally would hold on to his humanity. I can't, Thomas whispered, eyes wide with terror. I didn't know it was like this. Please, you have to understand. They told me it was a ritual, but it's alive. It's been fed for centuries. If it wakes up, if it gets loose. Thomas didn't finish his sentence. His body began to spasm, his legs buckling beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, eyes wild and unfocused. Duncan reached for him instinctively, but before he could get close, Thomas's eyes snapped open. The dark veins had now reached up into his face, turning his features into a mask of horror. His mouth stretched open impossibly wide, a stream of thick black blood dripping from his lips. Without warning, Thomas grabbed Duncan by the arm, his grip like iron. They want you too, Thomas rasped, his voice distorted, guttural. They need you. They need your blood, your soul, your essence. Duncan's heart hammered in his chest as he struggled to break free from Thomas's grip. The black veins pulsed as if alive, and for a moment, Duncan could hear the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the walls of his mind. It was calling to him. Thomas's body jerked violently. "It's calling you!" he cried, his voice now barely human. "It wants to feast on you too, Hunter!" Duncan couldn't think. His mind raced, but his body moved on autopilot, dodging Thomas's desperate lunge. The man had become a creature. No, something worse. Something unnatural. The firstborn creature in the pit began to stir. Its massive, warped form shifted and slid across the floor like liquid, its gaze locked on Duncan. Its mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, its jagged teeth gleaming in the low light. Duncan's breath came in shallow gasps as he looked for a way out. There was none. The stone walls surrounded him like a tomb. The only exit was the passage behind him, the way they'd come down. But it was too late. They were trapped. There was no escaping this house and this nightmare. He reached for the vial of silver mist at his waist, the one his father had given him, etched with runes of protection. He fumbled with the cork, his hands slick with sweat. The beast was almost upon him now, its skin rippling as though made of dark liquid, its grotesque form ever shifting. "Now, Duncan," Alira's voice cooed from behind him. "Give it your blood." "Never," Duncan spat, tearing the cork off the vial and tossing it into the air. The mist erupted in a fine, shimmering spray, filling the air around him with silver dust. It erupted like a cloud, spreading quickly, burning the air with its stinging bite. The creature hissed, recoiling from the mist as though it were acid. Its skin sizzled, blackened, and peeled away, leaving scars of raw, bloody flesh beneath. Duncan didn't wait. He lunged toward the pit, desperate to reach the creature's heart. If he could just destroy the source of its power, it would die. He had to end this now. He reached into his bag for the final weapon, his father's blade, the silver sword that had been passed down through generations of hunters. The sword hummed in his grip, the weight of its history heavy in his hands. With one swift motion, Duncan thrust the blade into the pit, into the heart of the firstborn. The creature's mouth opened wide, but instead of a scream, a sickening crack split the air. The firstborn's body spasmed violently, its form twisting and thrashing like a dying insect. Its enormous limbs broke and contorted, but it didn't die. Not quickly. Not without a struggle. "No," Alira's voice sounded strained, almost frantic. "It's not supposed to be like this." Duncan gritted his teeth and twisted the blade deeper into the creature's chest. The mist of silver around him intensified, now burning the air with searing heat, choking the life from the beast. But Alira was here, her presence rising like a dark cloud above them, suffocating the room with her malice. The creature writhed in agony, but with one final screech of pain, it fell silent. Its body collapsed inward, its glowing eyes fading to black. For a moment, all was still. Then, a tremor shook the ground, as if the city itself had exhaled in relief. The pit where the firstborn had resided began to sink back into the earth, the stone collapsing in on itself. Duncan stumbled back, barely able to keep his footing. Behind him, Thomas lay motionless, his body twitching. His veins had begun to retract, the blackness in his skin slowly fading, but it was clear he was beyond saving. The echoes of Alira's fury filled the room, and Duncan spun around to face her. "You killed it!" Alira's voice was filled with venom, but there was something else there, something rising within her. The sound of it filled the air like 1,000 whispers. "You should not have done that. I did what I had to." Duncan spat, his breath ragged. "And now I'll do the same with you." Alira's form blurred. her body splitting into shadows. For a moment, Duncan couldn't see her at all, until the shadows coalesced in the center of the room, solidifying into her monstrous form. Her eyes were wide, filled with a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. "You don't understand, Hunter," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "This city is ours. We are the true rulers here, and you are just another pawn." Duncan's eyes narrowed. His father's sword was still clutched tightly in his hand. "I'm not your pawn, Alira," he growled. "And I don't answer to you." With that, he lunged. Part 4. The Darkness Within. Duncan's heart thudded like a drumbeat in his chest as he charged forward, the weight of his father's sword heavy in his hand. The blade shimmered with silver light, reflecting the twisted shadows of Alira's form. She was everywhere, her presence, an overwhelming storm of hunger and malice. Her laughter echoed through the chamber, cold and cruel. "You think you can stop me?" Her voice slithered through the air like a serpent, wrapping around Duncan's mind. "You are nothing but a fleeting moment in the grand design. You will die just like the rest of them." But Duncan's focus was razor-sharp, his senses honed by years of training in battle. He didn't stop, didn't hesitate. His feet moved faster than his mind, and his instincts drove him forward. He swung the sword. The air crackled with energy as the silver blade sliced through the darkness. Alira's form faltered for just a moment, as if she had been struck, but she quickly reformed, her figure reassembling like black smoke. She hissed with fury. "You think a weapon made by men can kill me?" Alira's voice became a screech, sharp and piercing. Her eyes flashed with a cold, inhuman rage. "I am beyond death, Hunter. I have transcended the weakness of the flesh." Duncan didn't care. He had one goal: to end this nightmare. He moved again, this time faster. The sword sang through the air, its silver edge glowing with an unholy light. Duncan reached out, aiming for her heart, but in that moment, the shadows that formed Alira shifted again. She moved like liquid, slipping out of his reach. His strike landed only on empty air. "You're too slow, too predictable," Alira taunted, her form reforming behind him. Duncan spun, but she was already gone, her laugh echoing around him, a sound that seemed to reverberate deep in his bones. The room shifted around him, the walls narrowing, the air growing thicker with the suffocating presence of her power. Suddenly, a coldness ran through him, not from the room, but from within his own body. His skin crawled. The sword in his hand felt heavy, as though it were no longer an ally but an anchor. For a brief moment, Duncan's vision blurred, and he stumbled, his breath coming in shallow gasps. What was happening to him? He didn't have time to ponder. Alira's form materialized in front of him, her body now towering, a monstrosity of shadow and malice. Her face was stretched in a cruel grin, her eyes glowing with the sickly light of hunger. "You think you can fight me?" she whispered, stepping closer, her breath cold against his skin. "You're already losing, Duncan. You've been marked since the moment you stepped foot in this house." The words wrapped around him like chains, suffocating, tightening with every syllable. He could feel something in his blood. It was wrong. Something was crawling through his veins, spreading like poison. His hand trembled on the hilt of the sword. No, this wasn't just physical. This was something deeper, something rooted in his very essence. The shadows whispered at the edges of his mind. "You can join us." Duncan stumbled back, shaking his head, trying to push away the dark thoughts that clawed at his consciousness. He knew better than to listen, knew better than to fall prey to the creature before him. But her power was so overwhelming, so intoxicating, that for a fleeting moment, he almost wanted to give in. He could feel the temptation gnawing at him, the promise of power, of control. The thirst for life was the oldest temptation of all. "No," Duncan forced through gritted teeth. "I'm not like you." A laugh, sharp and cruel, erupted from Alira. "You say that now. But given long enough, and you will be." Before Duncan could react, her hand shot out, fingers elongated into claws. She gripped his throat, lifting him from the ground. Her touch was like ice, freezing him from the inside out, draining the warmth from his very being. His sword slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor, forgotten. "You're too weak, Hunter," she hissed. "You're already one of us. I can feel it. Your blood sings to me. It calls to me." Duncan struggled, gasping for air, but Alira's grip tightened, cutting off his breath. The walls closed in around him. Panic began to claw at his chest, but he forced himself to focus, his mind whirling with thoughts of survival. Suddenly, the air shifted. The smell of burning silver filled his nostrils, and Alira's grip loosened, just for a moment. Duncan's head swam, his vision fading. But then he heard it. A voice, soft but clear, rising from the depths of his memory. "Use it." It was his father's voice. The voice that had taught him everything he knew about hunting things that should never have walked this earth. The voice that had instilled in him the courage to fight, no matter how overwhelming the odds. Duncan's hand shot out, seizing the discarded silver vial he had dropped earlier. Without hesitation, he crushed it in his palm, releasing a burst of silver smoke that filled the air. The mist swirled around him, shimmering with power, and for a moment, he felt a surge of strength he had never known. "No!" Alira screamed, releasing him as the silver smoke burned her, searing her flesh with blinding light. Duncan's vision cleared, his body no longer sluggish. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for his very soul. He gripped his father's blade, the silver edge gleaming in the dim light, and with a roar of defiance, he swung it at Alira. The sword collided with her, its silver edge tearing through her shadowy form. Alira screeched in agony, her body dissolving like ash in the wind. For a moment, it seemed as though she might fade away entirely, but she wasn't finished. No, she was just beginning. With a wave of her hand, the ground beneath Duncan's feet cracked. The chamber shuddered, and he felt himself falling, plunging into a deeper abyss. He tried to scramble, to hold on to anything, but the world around him twisted and buckled like a nightmare come to life. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was Alira's twisted smile, her voice lingering in the shadows. "You cannot defeat us, Duncan. You will never escape this city. We are in the blood of New York. You are already ours." Part 5. The End of the Bloodline. Duncan's mind swirled in the abyss as he fell deeper into the pit. The darkness consumed him, drowning his senses, leaving only the sensation of weightlessness. He didn't know how long he fell, but time no longer existed in this place. The walls of his consciousness closed in, and the whispers returned, low, maddening murmurs that scratched at the edges of his sanity. "You belong to us?" His breath caught in his throat. No, he thought fiercely. Not like this. Not now. He fought to focus, to call upon the remnants of the silver mist that still lingered in the recesses of his mind. His fingers twitched, longing for the touch of the blade, but it was gone. The sword, his weapon, had vanished along with the ground beneath his feet. "Fight," his father's voice echoed in the depths of his thoughts. "You are not just the blood of a hunter. You are the blood of those who never surrendered. Don't let them win." Duncan clenched his fists, the sound of his pulse pounding in his ears. He wasn't sure if he was still falling or if the world around him had shifted entirely, but his resolve was clear. He was no longer a pawn, not even a hunter. He was something more, and he would not be consumed. In the darkness, he willed the mist back to life, drawing on the ancient power buried deep within him. It was a part of his lineage, something his father had never fully explained but had always hinted at, a secret passed down through generations of monster hunters. Silver alone isn't enough to defeat them, son. You'll need more than steel. Duncan gasped, his chest tightening as the shadows began to shift around him. The whisper stopped, but something else emerged from the void. A figure, standing at the edge of his awareness. The air rippled, and before him stood a silhouette, a man, tall and impossibly thin, with eyes like burning coal. You should not have done that. The figure's voice was cold, like the wind that whispered through dead trees. But you are strong. I didn't expect that. Duncan's head snapped up, hard hammering. Who are you? The figure stepped forward, his form becoming clearer. He was tall, with sharp features and a pale, almost translucent complexion. His eyes flickered with an ancient, cruel fire, and for a moment, Duncan felt as if the world had tilted. The figure was familiar in a way that felt wrong. I am the one who awoke her, the figure said, his lips curling into a smile. And you, Hunter, are the one who will finish what she started. The realization struck Duncan like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just a vampire or some blood drinker. No, this was far worse. This was the source. Duncan couldn't finish the thought. The words caught in his throat. The figure nodded, as if reading his mind. I am the first. The one from whom all this bloodline was born. The thing that calls from beneath this city. They call me Karak, the Old One. And now you and I are bound by a contract forged in the blood of New York itself. Duncan's legs shook. The realization set in with sickening clarity. Karak. The name was an ancient curse, a being born long before the first vampires, a creature that had seeded its spawn across the world, only to be buried beneath the weight of time. You're part of this, Duncan breathed. This curse. This bloodline. And you want to use me, don't you? Karak's laugh was a cold, merciless sound. Use you? No. I made you, Hunter. I made you what you are. And now I will take what is mine. Suddenly, Duncan felt it, something inside him, deep in his chest, throbbing in time with the beating of his heart. His breath hitched, and he reached up to clutch his shirt. The dark whispers returned, louder this time, and the shadows grew, pulling at him like an invisible hand. His skin began to burn, as though fire had been poured over him. What is this? What's happening to me? Duncan gasped, stumbling backward. Karak's figure was now a mere shadow, his voice a mocking rasp. You are becoming what you were always meant to be. A part of the firstborn, a son of the bloodline. You will never escape it. And soon you will hunger like we hunger. Duncan's mind screamed. He had always known there was more to his family's past than his father had let on. But this curse that had been passed down through the generations, was something he could never have imagined. No! Duncan shouted. I won't let you! I won't! The ground beneath him cracked open once more, and suddenly, he was no longer alone. The shadows seemed to form into shapes, hunched figures emerging from the blackness. Vampires. The firstborn. And behind them stood the true horrors of Alira's bloodline. The ones whose power was so vast, so old, it stretched into the deepest corners of history. Karak moved toward him, his pale face glowing with malevolent delight. You can't stop it. You can't fight what flows in your veins. You belong to me. All of you belong. Duncan's body convulsed, and for a moment, he felt the crushing weight of everything, his father's legacy, the curse that had haunted his bloodline, the darkness that had lived in the very marrow of his bones. But even as his body rebelled against him, his spirit refused. He would not succumb. I refuse. Duncan gasped through clenched teeth. You will not have me. His hand, trembling, reached into his pocket. The silver mist still lingered there, faint but alive. He needed it. He had to end this. For his father. For the city. For everyone who had been marked by this damnable curse. Duncan closed his eyes, drawing from the well of power that had been passed down to him. It wasn't just silver. It was something deeper. Something ancient. Something that Karak could never possess. With a roar of defiance, Duncan opened his eyes and released the mist in one final, explosive burst. The silver swirled around him, growing brighter, and the shadows screamed in agony. The figures around him recoiled, and Karak himself howled in rage. No! Karak shrieked. You can't. But it was too late. The mist enveloped Karak, dissolving his form into dust. The shadowy figures disintegrated into nothingness, their screams fading into the distance. Duncan stood at the epicenter of it all, breathing heavily, his body trembling. It was done. But Duncan knew that what he had done came at a cost. The bloodline was no longer just a curse, it was his. He could feel it now, a part of him that could never be erased. The darkness, the hunger, it was inside him. He had won. But at what price? As the room around him began to settle, the silence pressing in like a vice, Duncan knew that the war was far from over. The bloodline was still alive. It was within him. And whether he liked it or not, he had become a part of something far older, far darker than he could ever understand. But for now, he had survived. And that, in itself, was a victory. The end.